This has been the most widely used main battle tank since the 1970s and is still fighting in conflicts today. Countless photos show its turret lying next to its burnt hull, making it seem like this tank has no place on the modern battlefield. Today we are looking at the T-72 from a slightly different angle. How good or bad this tank really is, how it ended up fighting against itself, and what it was like to serve inside one. Let's begin. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union needed to counter NATO's growing armored forces as new tanks like the M60 Patton and Leopard 1 were emerging. In response, they developed three major tank models, the T-64, T-72, and T-80. All of them would go through various upgrades and modifications over the years. The T-80 was the most advanced, usually receiving the best upgrades and cutting-edge technology. The T-64 was well-equipped, more complex, and more expensive, reserved for elite tank units. The T-72, on the other hand, was built to be cheaper and easier to mass-produce, following the World War II Soviet doctrine of overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers. It was designed for conscript armies, made easy to operate, and allowed crews to get familiar with it quickly. The infamous autoloader removed the need for a fourth crew member. This made the tank smaller, lighter, faster, and lower to the ground, making it a harder target while still packing a serious punch. To avoid overwhelming you with versions, upgrades, and technical specifications, we are going to focus on the T-72 as a whole. It has been in service since the 1970s, going through 5 major redesigns and dozens of smaller upgrades, but at its core it remains the same tank. It quickly saw combat and kept fighting in nearly every major conflict around the world. Depending on the battlefield and the enemy it faced, the T-72 had varying degrees of success. But one thing is certain, you would not want to be its crew member. However, that was not necessarily just the tank's fault. You see, the tank was developed in the 1970s with the idea that it would be used in a specific way, relying on tactics similar to those of World War II, where most threats came from the front, either from other tanks or from anti-tank guns. But it would end up fighting on modern battlefields against modern weapons, where combat had changed significantly. The T-72 entered service in 1973 and quickly became the backbone of Soviet armored forces. It was also widely exported to friendly nations in a slightly downgraded version, the T-72M1, with its armor and fire control systems as the main differences. It would see combat for the first time during the Iran-Iraq War, where hundreds of Soviet-supplied T-72s in the hands of Iraqis fought against British-made Chieftains, American-made M60 Pattons, and older tanks used by Iran. Iraqi T-72s outclassed most of Iran's older tanks with their 125mm smoothbore gun, composite armor, and autoloader, but they also suffered losses to Iran's well-trained Chieftain crews. The Chieftains had strong frontal armor and a powerful 120mm gun, making them a serious threat in direct engagements. However, the war ended in a stalemate, without any conclusive results on how good the T-72 actually was. Then the Gulf War began, and a real disaster for the T-72 in Iraqi hands. You have all heard of Operation Desert Storm and how hundreds of Iraqi T-72s were destroyed by American Abrams tanks without a single Abrams being lost to enemy fire. They were destroyed in desert combat despite having the terrain advantage, but this was due to many factors beyond just the tanks themselves. Then came the Chechen Wars, some of the most horrific modern conflicts. Here, the major vulnerability of all Soviet-made armored vehicles was brutally exposed as they suffered tremendous losses in urban combat. Columns of tanks and armored vehicles were sent into an attack on Grozny, the infamous battle for the Chechen capital, but they were sent without proper infantry support and a well-prepared enemy was waiting. In heavy urban combat, experienced Chechen fighters used hunter-killer tactics to wreak havoc on Russian T-72s moving through the city. The RPG-7 was extremely deadly when fired at weak spots from buildings and bombed-out streets, where Chechen forces had set up a strong defense. This was where the problem with ammunition storage in the T-72, which is widely discussed today in Ukraine, became devastatingly clear. Inside the tank, about 900 kilograms of propellant charges, high explosive shells, fuel, and other ammunition were stored right beneath the crew. All it took was one spark in the wrong place for a catastrophic explosion that would send the T-72's turret flying through the air. You can imagine the outcome for the crew. Hundreds of Russian tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed in well-executed ambushes, where handheld anti-tank weapons became the T-72's worst enemy. Another lesser-known conflict where a variant of the T-72 suffered the same fate was in the Balkan Wars, during the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The M84 was a Yugoslav improved version of the T-72, a highly respected and modern tank at the time. However, it met a similar fate to Russian tank crews in Chechnya, as mostly young and inexperienced tankers were sent into the city of Vukovar without infantry support. Vukovar became one of the most horrific examples of urban combat. A large number of M84s were destroyed in the same way, as RPG-7s in the hands of the city's defenders inflicted devastating losses on Yugoslav tanks. Some experienced tank commanders even refused orders to enter the city without infantry, knowing it was a suicidal mission. Defenders would set up fake bunkers and decoy targets, and as the tanks turned their cannons to fire at them, they were ambushed from the opposite side, struck directly in their weakest spots. After suffering disastrous losses in urban battles, it became clear that the T-72 was dangerously vulnerable to handheld anti-tank weapons. The RPG-7, a simple and widely available anti-tank weapon, could penetrate the sides of T-72s in close-range ambushes. Horrifying images of burning T-72s with turrets blown off their hulls appeared in nearly every major battle where the tank was used. In the Syrian civil war, the T-72s were once again deployed, but they were decimated once more, this time by American-supplied tow missiles and Soviet RPGs in the hands of Syrian rebel forces. The lessons of past wars had not been fully learned or implemented, and the Syrian army struggled to adapt to modern anti-tank threats. Something had to be done to prevent tanks from being so easily destroyed by simple handheld weapons. Explosive reactive armor had already been developed during the Cold War, but it became far more widespread in the post-Soviet years as tank crews desperately needed extra protection against rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank guided missiles. Small explosive bricks were mounted on the exterior of the tank, and when a shaped charge warhead hit the armor, the ERA block would detonate outward, disrupting the incoming projectile and reducing its penetration power. The Soviets had already started equipping T-72s with early ERA designs in the 1980s, but after conflicts like Chechnya and Iraq exposed the problem on a massive scale, newer generations such as Contact 5 and Relikt were introduced. But as tanks adapted, so did the weapons designed to destroy them. RPGs and missiles began using tandem warheads featuring two separate charges designed to defeat ERA. The first charge detonated the explosive armor, while the second penetrated the main armor underneath. In response, metal cages and slat armor were added to the exterior of tanks, especially over the turret and engine areas. These were meant to prematurely detonate RPGs before they could directly strike the tank's main armor, reducing their effectiveness. However, no matter how much extra armor was bolted onto a tank, the constantly evolving battlefield always found a way to counter it. As more advanced anti-tank weapons entered service, top attack missiles such as the American Javelin and Swedish NLAW completely bypassed traditional armor layouts. These weapons targeted the weakest part of the tank, the thin armor on top of the turret. No amount of explosive reactive bricks or welded-on plates could fully protect the tank, especially the T-72 family, due to the way its ammunition is stored. An explosion above the turret roof, which is the weakest spot on almost all tanks, could detonate the ammunition inside or take out the crew without even needing to penetrate the armor itself. By the way, did you know that the T-72 could snorkel? One of the most interesting and perhaps most terrifying features of this tank is its snorkeling capability. It uses a snorkel system to keep the engine running while driving along the riverbed. Crews had to be specially trained for river crossings, learning what to do if the tank stalled underwater and how to escape. Special training turrets were deliberately flooded to simulate what a real-life escape would be like, since the only way to get out was to first flood the tank itself. During exercises, engineers and divers stood by in case a tank stalled and failed to surface. Preparing a T-72 for a deep river crossing took about 45 minutes and followed a three-stage process. All the necessary equipment for waterproofing and snorkeling was stored on the tank itself. As strange as it might sound, this technique was highly effective, but it was rarely used in combat. However, the impact of new weapons on tank warfare can be seen nowhere more clearly than in Ukraine. T-72s are fighting each other on a massive scale, with both sides using modernized versions with better optics, digital fire control, and upgraded armor. Yet, despite these improvements, both sides have suffered enormous tank losses with the introduction of drones. Drones have proven to be extremely deadly to tanks, delivering shaped charges and RPG warheads directly into weak spots using FPV kamikaze drones, avoiding explosive reactive armor and cages. In response, jammers were added onto tanks to disrupt radio-guided drone signals, but then optically guided drones were introduced, bypassing the tank's defenses once again. Now, tanks are being absurdly packed with overhead protection, covered in cages, plates, and additional armor, all in an attempt to stop these attacks. Yet there is still no real way to fully protect tanks, and this is not just a problem for T-72s. Even modern NATO tanks, such as the Leopard 2, Abrams, and Challenger 2, are not faring much better against these evolving threats. When the T-72 was designed 50 years ago, no one could have imagined the threats tanks would face today. Yet, despite everything, this constantly modified tank is still in use today, against all odds. It is uncertain how much longer it will remain on the battlefield, but one thing is clear. For its crews, the job is becoming more and more dangerous. The question is not if their tank will be hit, but when it will be the next to have its turret blown off in a catastrophic explosion.